Hi, folks. So, welcome to The Way I See It, which is my podcast on all things money, the economy, finance, and all that. So, I've always wondered, right, what happened to agriculture in Nigeria? Specifically, what happened to like the palm oil, the groundnuts, the cash crops, and all that stuff that Nigeria used to export. You'll often hear in Nigeria every time crude oil prices fall and Nigeria goes into a fiscal hole, you always hear we're going to diversify the economy, quote unquote, meaning that Nigeria is really like a mono forex earner. And we want to go back to the good old days when agriculture was, like we had the groundnut pyramid, the palm oil, the rubber, cocoa, and those were like generating forex for the nation. And we were like doing very well. So there's always this push to diversify, to go back to those good old days. But what exactly happened to agriculture? That's really what I try to find out. I try to do some research and find out what happened. Everyone always says crude oil happened and then Nigeria lost, we lost sight of agriculture and then we all went into crude oil and, the rest is history. But I don't think the data holds up if you do a critical study of what really happened to Nigeria in terms of agriculture. So let me lay the background for you with some data. If you were a Nigerian in 1961, right? Or let's say by 1961, Nigeria had about 42% of the global market in groundnuts. So 42% of that total market share, the total world market for groundnuts, Nigeria held 42% of it. That's a lot, right? But by 1970, we had gone from 502,000 metric tons to about 291. So nearly half was gone by 1970. By 1980, zero. Nigeria had no export whatsoever of groundnuts, zero. So clear progression from 502 to 291 to zero. And this happened from, say, 1961 to 1970 to 1980. So, I mean, if you went to the north back then, northern region back then, you would see pyramids, and those were like, that showed you the amount of production that was going on in the north. The richest man in Africa right now, Aliko Dangote, his great grandfather was a businessman that I understand was involved in the trade of groundnuts. That's where that trade and all that money came from. And you could see these pictures of pyramids of groundnuts all over northern Nigeria, right? And now it's all gone, gone away. And so let's put the pause on that and let's talk about, say, palm oil. Same statistic. By 1961, Nigeria controlled, give or take, about 27% of the total palm oil trade in the entire world. I mean, there was a time Nigeria controlled more than that, right? But 1961, we were about 27% of the total trade in the entire world. So we were doing about 167,000 metric tons of palm oil in 1961. By 1970, we're doing only eight. That's eight. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 metric tons. By 1980, zero. We were doing no exports whatsoever. So the exact same thing with groundnuts. 1961, 42%, 1980, zero. Same thing with palm oil. 1961, 27%, 1980, zero. And if you go to cotton, you go to to cocoa, it's the same story. 1960s, we're doing very, very well. 1970s, it's crashed or it's basically flatlined. And by 1980, it's literally gone off, it's zeros. So there's a pattern here. There's a clear pattern that you can see. Agricultural output was very, very high. Then it's subsided, and then it just basically goes away by 1980s. So the question is there something between 1970, 1980 that gives us a clue to what happened? I think there is, right? And I think we should then look at the oil earnings. That's going to be our first clue, and see what oil contributed to the Nigerian economy from 1960 when Nigeria got independence to say 1972 when we start to see all this happening. So the key thing to note here is this: from 1960 to 1972, crude oil literally was about $3 a barrel. Not a lot, $3 a barrel from 1960 to 1972. As at 1970, crude oil's contribution to the total revenue of Nigeria was 26%. It wasn't a lot, it was 26%. So we see groundnuts, we see palm oil go from 1960 highs of 42% total market share in groundnuts, from 27% total market share for palm oil, to literally zeros by 1970, 1980. But the argument cannot be that oil caused that, because by 1970, crude oil was only 26% of Nigeria's income. So Nigeria could not replace palm oil and groundnuts that she was a world leader in with crude oil that was only giving her less than 30% of total revenues. The numbers don't add up. So there has to be something else going on, right, that would cause Nigeria to just fall all the way from 42% to say 8%. But let's go back and answer this question. Could crude oil really replace, say, palm oil? I mean, that's going to be the second thing we want to talk about. Even if we say that crude oil was a high earner at $3 a barrel, which we've shown is not, could crude oil really replace palm oil? Let me give you a data point. In 2020, the 2020 last year, Indonesia made 18.45 billion United States dollars exporting palm oil. That's $18 billion. Yeah. To put that in context for you, $18 billion is more than the 2020 budgets of Lagos, of the entire Southeast, and the entire South plus Ondo. I added Ondo there because that's where they have all the crude oil in Nigeria. So the point I'm making is this: Indonesia's palm oil exports are more than the total state budgets of Lagos, all the crude oil producing states that exist in the South and Southeast, including Ondo, which also has crude oil. So just think about that Indonesia kept on exporting crude oil to the point that in 2020, the size of just their crude oil exports far exceed what Akwa Ibom, Rivers, Bayelsa, Delta, Lagos, Abia, Imo, and Ondo, which are our crude oil states, are doing. So even if the argument was that crude oil in 1970s, the price went up to say 11 because of the Arab oil embargo, still palm oil was still a moneymaker. You could still export palm oil and still make billions of dollars. As a matter of fact, the Central Bank of Nigeria did give us a data point as well. They said that if Nigeria had continued to export crude oil and had continued and kept up with its export of crude oil, that Nigeria today would be making, give or take, about 20 billion from exports of crude oil. This is from the Central Bank of Nigeria, right? So the second point about crude oil coming in and totally wiping away palm oil, groundnuts, cotton, it doesn't hold water again. Because number one, we've seen that crude oil was only 30% of the Nigerian total budget, total income, only 30%. And number two, we've seen that palm oil itself was a significant earner of forex. So it wasn't crude oil. Crude oil at 30% cannot wipe away palm oil and cotton and groundnuts, because palm oil itself earned forex, groundnuts and forex, and it was only 30%. So the real culprit I think I found out has to do with the fiscal federalism that Nigeria adopted from 1970. And just to define what fiscal federalism is, it's just a way of how the federal, the state, and local governments share the fiscal revenue, so the tax revenues. So in a federal republic, which Nigeria was, when tax revenues come in, you could say fiscal federalism described the way Nigeria would then share out those revenues. And those revenues, I'm going to give you the progression and you see if you can spot where we had a major change. So let's start from 1953, which was the last record I could get, the latest record I could get, right? We had the Sir Lewis Chick formula for sharing fiscal revenues. And he was British. So 1953, Nigeria was not yet a republic or independent. So he basically said 50% of export duties should go to the state of origin of export by derivation. What that meant was if Kano produces groundnuts and Kano exports groundnuts, right? 50% of the share of the export of groundnuts, what Nigeria would earn from the export of groundnuts, 50% will go back to the northern region. So they'll say Kano, 50% goes back to them because they generated the groundnuts. So by principle of derivation, they get 50% back of the export earnings. By 1958, we had Commissioner Reisman. He basically amended Sir Chick's formula. And he basically said 100% of the export revenues would go back to the state of origin by derivation. So by 1958, if Kano exported groundnuts, Kano would get 100% of the proceeds of groundnuts back to Kano because they generated those export proceeds. Does that correspond to the period where we see Nigeria having a 42% market share in groundnuts? Yes. Does it correspond to the period where we see Nigeria having 27% share of global palm oil produce? Yes. In every cash crop, cotton, palm oil, cocoa that you go back to, you will see that the golden years were in the 1958, 56, all the way to 1963. Why? Because you had this share, 100% of the exports proceeds by derivation, remained in the region slash states. 1963, Nigeria was now independent, and Nigeria had a constitution, and that constitution still maintained 100% of the export proceeds go back to the state of origin, or in this case, the region, by derivation. That still stood, and that was when we had the high exports. Let's talk about the 1970 decree. Decree meaning that the military had then taken over and ruled by decree. So you had the 1970 decree number 13. In this case, the military comes in and states, listen, states, you've lost your fiscal autonomy. So Kano or the regions could no longer then get their share of the proceeds of exports. That was gone. There was derivation, but the distributed pool, the fiscal autonomy, that was gone. By 75, they reduced derivation to 20%. By 77, the Aboyede Commission basically had taken derivation to 0%. And then we had you had then the FAC come in, the Consolidated Reserve come in. So derivation was now zero. So let's catch our breaths and recap what we just talked about. By 1961, Kano had a 42% share of global exports of groundnuts. And when Kano exports groundnuts, Kano retains 100% of the exports proceeds of groundnuts. What does that mean? That means the regional leaders, the state governor, the commissioner knows that every farmer farming groundnuts in that state is a potential FDI, a potential FBI, a potential earner of foreign income to Kano. So he's going to give him fertilizers, he's going to give him a marketing board, he's going to support him in any way he can. Because once groundnuts go out through the port, Kano gets a credit in her account in pounds or US dollars. That's exactly what the motivation was. That's why we were at 42%. But in 1970 to 1977, you had the change in the fiscal federalism laws in Nigeria that then took away Kano's right to retain 100% of the groundnut derivation of the groundnut revenues via derivation and took it to zero. So there was no more incentive for the local commissioner, the local farm extension worker to support farming in Kano because there was no direct benefit to the state by the export of groundnuts. But that's not enough to simply say because we're not going to support the state of Kano, then groundnut pyramid to disappear. Something else must have happened, and I have that answer for you. When Nigeria scrapped derivation and took it to zero, what did Nigeria do? Nigeria created the Consolidated Revenue Fund, right? And then we had what's called the FAC, the Federal Allocations Committee or whatever. And what they did was they then had a formula to say, when you sell groundnuts, right, all the money goes into this central account. Then we'll then share this central account to all the states according to a formula. The formula Nigeria uses was called, we have the horizontal and the vertical formula. The horizontal formula goes something like this. If you are a state, by principle of equality, you will get 45% of that pool, right? The states as a whole, the entire state as a whole, got 32%. The federal government retained 47%, and the local government were at 15%. So that entire pool, you see, the states got 32%, the federal got 47%, the local government got 15%, right? Now, in that 32%, if you were a state, you just by the principle of equality, you got 45%, right? If you had a larger population, you could get 25% as well. If you had a large land mass, you could also get 5%. So understand what's going on here. Simply by being a state, you already have 45% of that pool. If you then have a large population like Kano, you get an extra 25%. So larger populated states get a higher share of that pool. And if you're a state like, say, Niger, that's big land mass, you get an extra 5, or you get more of those points because you're land mass. So Kano, follow me now, Kano lost 100% revenues from the exports of groundnuts, and Kano replaced that with 65% minimum by simply being a state, having a large population. So the incentive shifted from exporting groundnuts to having a large population. That was it. You then had the Nigerian population figures being a bigger barometer, a bigger point that the governors could chase than exports of cash crops. And that's exactly what happened. Whatever you incentivize, you get. If you reward anything, you get more of it. So population replaced derivation. And that's why you then saw the groundnut pyramids, the palm oil export all go to waste because the individuals farming no longer got the support of their state government. The state government didn't have to support them. The state government simply had to be a state and get 45% by equality. If they had a large population, they got an extra 25. They didn't have to support the farmers. The farmers were paying taxes to the federal government, and the federal government was taking the taxes back to the states in the 32%. So the thing was literally, you turned a working system on its head. You took away the incentive for Abia State to support palm oil, for Kano State to support groundnuts, and you said, no, Abia, just be a state, get 45%. If you have a larger population, we'll give you 25%, and that's it. So the states, well, they look the other way. Go fend for yourselves, private sector. If you have a farm, go farm. If you have a plantation, go get your own loan. But we are not going to spend our money that we could use to develop roads and develop mechanized farming because we're not going to get a revenue from that. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Nigerian exports fell. Remember the point I made from the beginning. You can calculate and draw the graph from 1961 to 1970 to 1980 when agriculture collapsed, i.e. cash crop agriculture exports. If it is simply crude oil, why then didn't agriculture bounce back when crude oil prices crashed in the 1980s or 1984? Why didn't they bounce back? If crude oil came and agriculture went down, when crude oil went back down, why didn't the granite pyramid spring back up again? Because the incentive was taken away. And we have never restored that incentive. And that is why we have never recovered in agriculture and the export of these cash crops. And it's not going to change. People are rewarded. You incentivize what you want to receive. If you simply reward states by population, land mass, and equality, then that's what you're going to get. Every census, you'll see a larger figure, but you will not see groundnut pyramids because there is no incentive to have groundnut pyramids. You, as an individual, can go to groundnut pyramids, but agriculture is always a public-private partnership everywhere in the world, including the United States of America. If you do not have the government support in agriculture, it can never grow. So it's not about fertilizers or tractors. It's about the incentive system that Nigeria has adopted. Palm oil, for instance, can be found in 24 states of the Federation. Kaduna, yes, Kaduna, Abia, Akwa Ibom, Cross River, Rivers, Bayelsa, Imo, Anambra, Ebonyi, Enugu, Delta, Edo, Ondo, Ogun, Osun, Oyo, Ekiti, Benue, Kwara, Kogi, Nasarawa, Plateau, Taraba, Adamawa, and Kaduna can grow palm oil. But how many palm oil plantations do you see in Nigeria that are working? They are all owned by the private sector, having private sector funds and all that, because there is no incentive for the state governments to go back in and really boost that sector. What's the solution? You've got to go back to where we were in 1960s. The difference between today and 1960s is not the price of crude oil, it's the incentive to the state. You've got to go back to the state and say, okay, if you export cash crops, make it cash crops. We will give you derivation the same way if you export crude oil, we will give you derivation. Which means if Kano exports groundnuts or cotton, if Edo exports rubber, then the state gets that dollar return as IGR, 13%, the same way the oil producing states get to retain 13% of their derivation when oil is exported. If you do that, then you have given an incentive to the state governors to create jobs to boost agricultural output, because that's going to go straight to their bottom line. It won't go to the Corporate Affairs Commission as federal taxes. It will go first of all to the states, 13%. Then the federal government then takes the balance exactly the same way the oil producing states have done. That's why you see the oil producing states in Port Harcourt, in Abia, they get privileges. The governors are supporting them. The governors support them with the oil communities. They pass laws for them. We've just passed the PIB, but nobody is going to pass any law for agriculture. The difference is not the price of oil. That's not what the problem is. The problem, as we've identified, is that the incentive that existed in 1960 that gave the states like Kano the right to retain 100% of export proceeds has been taken away. If you give the states back that incentive process to retain a share of the export proceeds when they export cash crops, then you will see agriculture start at the base level, at the state and local government level, to then go back up, and then you see the plantations of palm oil and groundnut pyramids come back again. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. Keep following us. The Twitter handle, FinPlanCaluAcha1. Guys, stay safe out there. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.